Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope you can hear us and see us. There's a lot of us up on your screen, but that's because this is going to be a pretty dynamic conversation, which we're really excited about. I'm Taryn. I am the Associate Director at Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. And we are so glad to have you be part of this conversation tonight with our guests about navigating the self, the other, and audience in poetry and prose. This is part of a series that we're hoping to do that's made possible by the Maine Humanities Council. And so this will just be the beginning of hopefully several conversations about the ways in which we write and how we encounter what's unfamiliar in our work and what's familiar. And Morgan and Samaa, we'll talk a little bit more about that too in a minute. But I'm just going to start off with some brief introductions of who we have as part of this conversation tonight. Thanks to a grant from the Maine Humanities Council, we've been able to work with two talented writers and leaders as Maine Lit Fellows. And they are really the heart, brain, and souls of this event. I'm going to introduce them first, and then I'll talk about our other special guests that we have here. Adichie currently works in coalition and domestic. Her academic writing can be found in the collections including Arab and Bad Girls in Transgressive Popular Television.
She's gone.
Oh, Taryn is frozen and might be gone. Thanks for your patience, folks, as we are figuring out the technology glitches. I am wondering if, Gibson, are you able to finish the welcome, the introductions? If not, we can wing it.
Yeah, I'm here. No problem. Looks like we just lost our Taryn for a minute. Yeah, we're just super excited to have this conversation happening tonight. We're super excited about what is to come in the conversations that we're still planning, and Samaa and Morgan are two really talented writers who are serving as our literary fellows, event fellows, and helping us, and really, as Taryn said, thinking and feeling through this series and planning it. I am going to...
I'm happy to introduce quickly Kelli and Lisa. I'm back, and I would love to introduce them if that's okay. Okay. Kelli Jo Ford is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and author of the highly acclaimed novel Crooked Hallelujah. She is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Paris Review's Plimpton Prize, the Everett Southwest Literary Award, the Catherine Bakeless Nason Award at Bread Loaf, a National Artist Fellowship by the Native Arts and Culture Foundation, an Adobe Paciano Fellowship. Her fiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Missouri Review, and the anthology 40 Stories, new writing from Harper Perennial. Welcome, Kelli. Thank you. Lisa Bunker, our other guest tonight, is a writer, elected official, and activist. Her two published novels for young readers, Felix Is and Zenobia July, both feature multiple LGBTQ+ characters. In 2018, she was one of the first few out trans people ever to be elected to the state legislature and is now serving her second term in the New Hampshire House, representing the town of Exeter. And also one more big thanks before we jump into Meryl Troop and her students who are providing ASL interpretation for tonight's event. So with that, we'll hand it over to Morgan and Samaa, and thanks for bearing with the technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Taryn. So did we want to start with what we're working on? what we've been writing lately, maybe as sort of an icebreaker into talking about some of these questions about writing the other?
Sure, that's a lovely idea. First, before we do that, I just want to let folks know, so we have an hour together, roughly 50 minutes together. So the four of us are going to talk for about 40 minutes or so. If you have questions that come up for you while we're talking, please drop them in the chat. Please write them in the chat, and then we'll spend 15 minutes at the end going over some of your, asking and responding to some of your questions. We probably won't get to all of them. We apologize, but please, as they come up for you, as we're talking, please drop them in the chat. Yes, let's start out with that question. And since I'm talking, I'll go ahead and start, and then I will hand it off to someone else. What am I writing? So to be honest with you, I'm writing a lot of lists. I'm going through a big transition in my work life, and that means that I need to wrap up a bunch of projects. And so, like, literally, I'm writing lists, and then I'm writing, like, for lack of a better phrase, like to-do manuals, like how to handle the work after I've gone. That's what I've been writing for the past month or so. I have not been writing any poetry since the beginning of the year, in all honesty. Kelli, what are you writing?
Thank you. So I've really struggled since during the pandemic to write at all. I'm banging out a lot of emails. I'm really good at that. And I think I just like, I start there because I can do that. And that is a tangible thing I can check off of my list that I'm also writing. But I've struggled to focus. And I think having like a debut book come out in the middle of the pandemic, and, there's a lot that goes along with that. A lot of, Zooms and like, did I even write a book, and how did this go? So a lot of anxiety, I think, built into that process, particularly for me, that and the pandemic is kind of like snowballed, and I've struggled to write, but I kind of feel like I was thrown a lifeline by an editor who asked if I had something to submit for kind of a special, kind of a quirky project. And I was like, I don't think so. I'm not really able to write right now. And creativity is just really hard. And later they're like, listen, the deadline got pushed back. What about now? And I was like, let me try. And so I'm working on this thing and that I'm editing, and it's kind of been, I feel like it was just a gift that the editor was kind enough to think of me, and then also to reach back out after I didn't think that I could do it. So I have edits that I'm working on, and it feels like a wonderful struggle. Like, once again, I'm back in the wonderful struggle, and it's kind of nice. Oh, let me hand it off. Lisa, what are you working on?
I actually just pressed send today on an email, sending a new manuscript to my agent. I started it last year, about 14 months ago. I was working on another project, a contemporary novel for adults, taking place in like today. And the problem was I didn't want to write about politics, and I couldn't put it in, and I couldn't not put it in because it was in my brain. So I set that aside, and I started writing a work specifically about what we've all been through in the past year. I wanted to live write the last year of the past administration. And I didn't know the pandemic was coming, but once the pandemic came, that too. And so I conceived of a novel in the form of transcripts of a weekly radio show. And the main character is a genderqueer DJ who rants about whatever happened in the news that week. And also people start calling in, and so there's plots that develop. There's a love interest and some family drama that happens because various people call the show. And because I wanted to try to really nail a prose style that looked and sounded like radio, I used voice recognition, and I narrated most of the novel rather than typing it. So I just, I inhabited my character. It was like a form of acting. And I ranted, and then, went back and shortened and tweaked and rearranged and cut and all the things you have to do. But I went right through the inauguration, and real life gave me some excellent plot twists. And so I've sent it off, and I hope to catch the front of what I assume to be a huge growing tsunami of books about 2020, you know, be that first novel in editors' inboxes. So we'll see how that goes.
Can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
Okay. So once the pandemic happened, did you have to like sort of rethink the entire, like, did you have to go back to the very beginning and did that shift the way, not the form, but did that shift the structure, the way that you were?
Because of the radio show setup, you mean, like that?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Fortunately, an invisible fictional station manager was a technical whiz and was able to set it up so that my host could host from home. So also I had sort of faltered in the project. So I had like a three-month gap, which I created plot reasons for afterwards. So my character sort of petered out in January and then came back in April, and the pandemic was on. So it turned out to be a really natural break.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. Morgan, your turn.
Lisa, that sounds amazing. And I have a million questions about all of it that I wish I could ask. I think like Kelli, I too sort of fell out of writing during the pandemic. Last summer, I'd started writing a new novel that examined family relationships of three sisters whose mother constantly lost custody of them. And it was sort of like this was the mother's last chance to get her children back. And it's the title of it was called like The Year of the Frog Clan. And it's not done yet. And I fell out of that, and I hope to get back to it soon. But I did, Kelli, as you said, you sort of like fell back into writing again. You like caught that passion, I think, recently with a story. I started writing a weird story. I finished a draft of it about a man who's in prison. He has a 500-year prison sentence for murder, but he was mentally ill, and he was a prepper, somebody who was preparing for the end of the world, and he was convinced zombies were coming and all of this stuff. And I deal with like Penobscot culture, and I try to take stories that are traditional and rethink about them in the context of popular culture, but in a way that isn't trying to manipulate them. So that's what I'm currently working on, and excited to actually get to revising tomorrow. All right, so we've all talked about what we're doing. I guess we can get into the conversation here. I want to welcome everybody, as Taryn did. So I think two central questions of this discussion are: what can be lost when writers are pushed to reformulate their poetry and prose for an imagined straight white audience? How can all writers benefit from asking and re-asking themselves tough questions about how they portray and encounter the unfamiliar in their work? So for Kelli and Lisa, you both write wonderful works for audiences that are, at times and most certainly, outside the direct experiences of the characters you're bringing to life on the page. I wonder, as a reader and of course as a writer, you know, what does that creation entail? You know, it's, you know, when we have a workable draft, when we have something that is publishable or ready to be sent out, you know, how does the eventual knowingness that your work will be read by outsiders guide further refinement of your work? You know, what do you take into consideration? And that's for either to answer.
I can start with that one. I think I would separate it out between the act of creation and then the sort of turning towards the publishing process. When I am creating, I try to give myself maximum freedom to just do whatever feels right, to just sort of channel my deepest creativity and originality that I can access at that time. And I have a lot of interest in trying to just go deeper with the craft all the time and get more and more uniquely real and personal in my voice. And so I try not to think about the market when I get started, and try to write what I want, especially when it comes to conveying the experience that I know as a trans person if I'm writing a trans character. My second novel, Zenobia July, is about a trans girl. And it was a marvelous opportunity to put into fiction a lot of the sort of unique and unusual experiences that trans people have as they face their dysphoria, as they consider transition, or if they're living in stealth, how they deal with just, you know, the perennial puzzles of getting dressed and getting ready to present to the world every morning. And so it was a marvelous opportunity to put that stuff in. And of course, I tried to write it as authentically as I could. When it comes to publishing, I know that there are going to be people reading this, my agent, people at the publisher who don't know trans experience. I'm aware that I'm going to need to maybe explain or defend some of my choices. It has only happened maybe once or twice where I've had to say, where I've had to be blunt and say, look, you're just gonna have to take my word for it. This is how it is. Most of the time I find people are respectful, but I've had to sort of be prepared to stake my claim for, you know, the things that I'm putting in. There's a very important scene in Zenobia where she gets teased about her eyebrows at school and starts to pluck them and gets a little bit carried away and ends up taking her eyebrows completely off. And it's a huge crisis for her as a girl and as a trans girl, both and separate. And I was asked to sort of downplay that scene, and they just didn't understand how important it was to her. And I had to explain that. I had to advocate for my scene. I shortened it, but I wouldn't cut it. And so that sort of thing, once you turn towards the process, you have to be ready to fight for what you believe in with regards to the presentation of what you know, because it's your personal experience.
Thank you. That was great.
I would agree. I think that my process is very similar to Lisa's as she described it. You know, I think that I go into the creation without really, I'm not thinking about an audience and what they know and what they don't know. I'm trying to craft a story and characters that feel true to like the situation I'm trying to create on the page, maybe true to my own personal experiences. And so that's not what I'm thinking of. And I'm a person that really has to like write from the ground up. If I have too many big ideas in my head, as I'm trying to both draft and revise something, I just get stumbled and I just hit a wall. So I just have to stay in that space of creation and the small moments with the character leading to bigger moments maybe, but so I'm not really thinking of that. And maybe I'm almost consciously trying to put any outside perspective away. And then later, I guess that's where the questions come in. And I think that I've been pretty lucky to work with some like a really thoughtful agent who was open to you know working with me as a debut author to revise, and you know he's interested in the editorial process, but it's also just really really sharp and empathetic and thoughtful, and then also to have that a pretty similar experience with editors I've worked with. So most of the issues I've dealt with have been smaller things, like maybe regional phrases or things that, you know, that people might be unfamiliar with. But you know, pretty small things. Like, is that really how somebody would say something, you know? And so for me, it just becomes a kind of a process of like give and take. Like, does this feel important to this piece and this character and to me as the author? And sometimes the answer is like, yeah, I'm gonna dig in, and like Google exists and I'm expected to Google a hell of a lot of things, you know, when I'm reading. And if somebody needs to Google something that's unfamiliar to them, that's fine with me. And sometimes like, yeah, no, that's fine. Like, yeah, sure. You can explain that. I'm comfortable with it. But yeah, that's been my experience. I feel like I've had, I think that I've been probably pretty lucky with the editors and agent that I've worked with so far. And I'm also on like a small, you know, an independent press, you know, like what's called a mid-size independent. So I'm with Grove, and I think that I'm really lucky that to work with. I think that they value they're thinking about more than a bottom line and appealing to the most people possible. They certainly want to sell a lot of books, but that maybe is not like why I ended up at Grove, because they thought they could sell the most books with Crooked Hallelujah.
Thanks. That's a great answer. I think, Samaa, did you have anything to add?
Go ahead.
What's that?
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I think it's very important, and I'm just going to go with this question as well, to separate, you know, the writing process or the creation process from the publishing process. I just know, I guess what sort of led me to ask this question or to think about it is I've always heard sort of horror stories from marginalized voices having to really reshape their work for it to sell, or for it to be familiar to people. I'm thinking of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. You know, she had said once when she was working on her novel as an undergraduate, her professor was like, these characters are unbelievable. And she was like, why? And he goes, because they're all like me, like a white man. And it didn't occur to him that African-American people can be just like him, right? Like it was completely absurd. It wasn't this thing that sold. So I guess it's really refreshing to hear both of you say that you haven't had very many issues with these types of things, because maybe there is a change happening in publishing. I'm going to knock on wood, but in publishing and editing diverse voices that doesn't try to shape them into something they're not, I guess.
So I'm curious. Thank you for your responses. I was like really enthralled, and I realized maybe I should come off of mute because I make a lot of verbal affirmations, and I was here going, so thank you for your answers. I am just curious about just the processes that you described about how you kind of sort of just try to go where the writing takes you, and I'm wondering if that's a different experience if you're writing characters that you feel like are deeply connected to who you are and your identity. So Lisa, I'm thinking you're talking about the experience of Zenobia as a trans character, as a trans girl and a girl. And I'm just curious about whether or not you are, if you're writing these characters who are closer to your own identity and your own experience, if you ask yourself certain questions about like, what is the most important thing to you in portraying that character or writing that character? What kinds of questions do you ask of your own writing if it's something that you're writing that's more connected to your identity?
Okay, yes. Well, there's a lot of different directions I could go with this. One thing for sure is that something I want to avoid is creating a kind of paragon out of my character, an instructive example, an average cis reader's easy first trans person or something like that. I don't want to sort of monkey wrench my character in any way to be a lesson or an example. I want her to be a wonderfully quirky, unique, flawed human character. I'm definitely interested in having my characters not be perfect. Zen has a temper. She does things impulsively. She gets herself in trouble because she has these character traits. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm also interested in her first as a character and second as a trans person, just like I bristle a little bit when, if in some new situation, somebody leads with my transness instead of saying, this is Lisa, she's a writer, she's a state legislator, blah, 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 and all the things who are me. The fact that I am trans is one not very important thing about me, and I want my characters to hit in the same way. Although I am also aware that when my book gets out into the world, Zen is going to be the first trans character that somebody has read. And so there is a tension there that needs to be negotiated between staying true to the craft again, which is making compelling characters and compelling stories and drawing people in and engaging their hearts so that they feel the story. That's my goal as a writer. But also I'm aware that this will be representation and that there will be certain expectations around that. And there is a tension sometimes. I don't have an easy answer about how to navigate or negotiate that tension. Just being aware and working with the various eyes that see the text before it gets to the public, and just talking it out, talking it through.
So I love that response, and the less cynical part of me wants to say that maybe part of my response to that tension you mentioned is like lies in craft. That if we are doing our jobs well enough and creating these whole characters on the page, that we're responding to that tension in ways, if that makes sense. I don't know that fully answers the question for me, but I do think that, so I'm, Crooked Hallelujah is about 4 generations of Cherokee women in a family, some mixed race, some not. And one of the main characters drinks a lot, and and so boom, there's a tension. Okay, am I portraying a stereotype? Yeah, but is that character a stereotype? I certainly hope not, because I certainly hope that I've created her so that if a reader reads the book and approaches her, that's not all they're going to take away from her. And they're going to see like a whole world of context. I hope, if I've done my job, a whole world of context to place her in. I hope, but that tension exists, and I don't feel like I've made, maybe like maybe our job is not to make peace with that tension, but just to exist within it, if that makes sense. There are some things I think about after the book is published, and think, did I get that right? Is that and I don't know, but I also think it would feel like incredibly unfair to take away a whole swath of experience from writers because you're afraid of delving into a stereotype. Like, well, sometimes like your experience reflects something that you want to explore for some reason, or I don't know. I think I'm starting to ramble, so can I pass the baton?
Can I do a follow-up? I just read a review the other day of a new book that's out. It's called Detransition Baby. It's by Tori Peters. And I haven't read it yet. I just skimmed the review, but I'm very excited and a little bit sort of disturbed by this book. It challenges and fascinates me because the reviewer said, this is a book about trans people, like when they're together talking to each other without cis people around. And it's like the real dirt on the actual lived trans experience. And it involves something which is politically loaded, which one of the characters detransitions. The character transitions from one gender to the other and then goes back. And that is an argument that is used in the current culture wars against trans people. Mm-hmm. People will raise the specter. I am trying to defeat a bill in the New Hampshire legislature this session that would make it child abuse to help your child with gender transition. So you can see how people coming up with stories of detransitioning, that would be fodder for the hateful people who are advancing this awful piece of legislation. But somebody wrote a novel about it, and as a writer, I'm jazzed about that. I'm really interested in this book because I do feel like I've been making sure my characters are largely positive, but wouldn't it be fascinating to write a trans woman who's like a real piece of work, who's difficult and unpleasant, and it just, but then I would have to worry about whether I'm doing something bad with regards to teaching the world about a misunderstood and maligned minority. So I'm interested that the project that I talked about a little while ago that I set aside to do this other book, that's 3 intertwined lives of trans women in contemporary America. And I'm beginning to think I'm going to have to make one of them like really difficult, just because we're not all perfect, and it's still great fiction, but there is a there's a puzzle there. It's interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't, this is just all making me think about just writing for, when you're writing for audiences so I feel like the conversation pivoted just a little bit when we're talking about like audiences that experience your work. And maybe, I know that when I write poetry, I often write a lot of poetry that for me is like, I'm writing about Blackness, I'm writing about family, and then, and I'm letting other people read my experiences of Blackness, my community's experiences of Blackness. And it's always an interesting thing, I think, particularly writing, I live in Maine, lots of the folks who are reading the things that I write don't share my same experience. And so I feel like we're also talking about audience and audience perception. And that's a thing I think about often. Like I put a thing out there in the world and it has a particular kind of resonance to me because, you know, these are the people I grew up with. And I don't know, and I don't know how it resonates with audiences who are white, who, you know, weren't raised in the Midwest like I was raised in the Midwest. But for them, it's like exciting to read this poetry that is by this Black person who looks like me, who's Muslim and all, and queer and all these things. So I don't know, it's just, I feel like there are no easy answers to that question. I was looking at, you know, when Morgan and I were coming up with questions there about, for this session, we were talking a lot about the idea of literary tourism and folks who are like really excited to read Kelli Jo's novel because it's like, oh, we're gonna learn some particular kind of experience, and just how tricky that is. So I don't have any easy answers. It's just making me think about all of these things that I think about sometimes when I'm writing my poetry.
Yeah, I think I took a course, a Native American literature course once, and the professor asked asked everybody why they were taking the course, and one person goes, "I'm really interested in arrowheads. That's why I took the course." So I think, you know, to follow up to this idea of literary tourism, you know, I think readers at large sometimes expect something that they've been led to believe is true for so long. I think a term that an academic, David Troyer, uses is, you know, exoticized foreknowledge, that, you know, as a writer, as myself, you know, I live in that world of creation. You know, I don't think about audience, but eventually I get to a point where I have to perhaps maybe anticipate how a reader will look at the work, and thinking about, you know, concepts of representation and stereotypes too, Kelli, right? Like alcoholism, you know, I feel like even in my stories, I write about it and I know it's a stereotype, but I'm also reminded too that, you know, it's not that stereotypes, I think Chimamanda Adichie said this also. She was like, it's not that stereotypes are untrue, but it's that they're incomplete. And I think having these, when we talk about character, when we talk about having characters on the page, you know, Lisa, you mentioned wanting to have one of them difficult, right? Like, I think when we have these polar opposites, when we have this messiness, is when, you know, prose and poetry comes to life at its most, where it's able to instruct, I think, and maybe shock the reader in a way that doesn't seem overwhelming. So I just wanted to add, I guess, to that conversation, you know, thinking about, you know, how readers read. I know we're writers, right? But we also think about our readers, and we have to, I think, maybe consider them sometimes.
I think so. And I think that's part of kind of just like the ongoing tension, you know, like we want to exist in sort of the act of creation, but the act of creation is there to be read. I really like that quote, Morgan. That's really wonderful. And that's kind of, I think, what I was ineloquently like getting at, that like you know, if I've done my job well, then there's so much more there than like, oh, this character Justine has a drinking problem. Like, and if that, you know, and then getting back to audience, like, if that is what somebody's going to take away from spending an entire book with her, like they're not my audience, you know, if that's what they take away from 300 pages of like life with Justine, because there's just, you know, there's so much more there. It's funny to say, I don't think it's a perfect work of fiction, but I think she's a character who is much, there's much more there for her in her life on the page, you know.
I would agree with you. Yeah.
I don't know how to say it, but it's like, no, like there's
what? Somebody just posted a question in the chat about not sure what you mean by literary tourism, and I'm gonna hazard a guess that it has something to do with picking up a book and saying, oh, I get to go to a new place and see the exotic natives, a kind of superficial sort of response to the presence of people whose experience is very, very different from your own, and sort of go and see that for a little while and, you know,
yeah,
take away some impressions. But I think as writers, our task is to lure people deeper. In my view, the ultimate point of fiction is to create human connection. The deeper, the better. And so I mean, maybe my jacket copy will end up being something in the way of, you know, it's created by the publisher, and maybe they try to pull people in with some sort of slick, easy idea about getting to learn more about the trans experience or something. But once people are in, I want them to become deeply entangled with my characters and see them and experience them as humans. And I feel like I've succeeded to the extent that that happens. And that comes back once again to craft, to being a good writer, which I would break down both into being able to work with language well, but also having you know, well-developed sense of empathy and voice, and being able to inhabit different characters effectively. We all create characters who are different from ourselves as soon as we have more than one character who's not based entirely on ourselves. We all do that some. And so I feel like there's a real talent and ability that you can be born with and also develop and nurture to be better at being the voice or the presence or the psychology of many different characters in a story, so that people experience each in turn and they get past a tourism level and they just become involved and they feel all the feels. I hope that's what we accomplish when we do our best work.
Yeah, I would just to add to what you said about literary tourism, Lisa, just that last bit that you said about not getting involved. And so the idea of a tourist is someone who will just stand there and watch the whatever it is happen in front of them, and they're unscathed by it. They're not actually engaging with it. And so that is the you know, what you're saying is the hope is that you're inviting the reader to do something other than literary tourism. I am curious about both of the process that both of you go through with editors or other readers when you're having them look at your work as you're in the process of crafting. I think it was something that you said, maybe Lisa, I cannot remember, but you said like after you've created a character, when you're having the conversation with the folks that are reading the pieces before they're published, what kinds of questions are you asking them about the characters that you're creating? What are you asking them to look for? What are you asking them to be aware of? And then there's a good question in the chat that I'm going to read after you respond to that. I don't know that I have a lot of experience with getting to quiz my agents and editors about my work. I send it to them and then they send me a response and I'm responding to them. And it's a kind of
sort of obstacle course that you need to navigate in order to get your book actually out into the world. And as Kelli Jo said before, there are good agents and editors, even excellent ones. And a really good editor is a rare and precious jewel. I have had one really good editor that I worked with, and it was so much fun because he really paid attention. He got down in the work with me. He had his own views, and he made me think and work, but he was respecting the work, and the book was better because he was involved. But I feel like I get my one big chance at the beginning. I create exactly what I want to create. I am thinking a little bit about what might sell and what might not, but mostly I'm creating what I want to create, and then I send it. And then I am a little bit on defense because people are gonna say, we don't like this. And then I have to decide whether this is one of the things I'm gonna fight for, or if I'm gonna capitulate. And if I'm gonna fight for it, how hard, and what do I wanna try to preserve here, what's important. I do find that useful in that I learn more about what matters to me in the work by what I'm willing to defend and what I'm willing to let go. But they're the gatekeepers, and everybody has their own read. The other thing I've learned is that everybody has their own read. Every single person receives a work differently. And nobody has the one right answer about what makes this good or not good. And so I try to keep in mind that while they have the power to say yes or no to this work, they don't have the power to tell me whether it's worthy or not. That's a struggle sometimes because ego is definitely in play, and a harsh critique hurts, but it's just part of the game. If your heart's not in it, you're not doing your best work. So yeah, there's this naked, vulnerable thing that's just part of the job, I guess. Yeah.
Go ahead, Kelli, if you want to.
Sure. So I'm not sure that I feel like what the kinds of questions I ask just vary, like story by story. Crooked Hallelujah is a novel in stories, so each chapter is a kind of little piece of its own world. So the kinds of questions I'm asking, like my first reader, I'm lucky to have a really good first reader for my work in-house. I married a poet. I highly recommend it to everyone. Prose writers, marry a poet if you can. But the kinds of questions I ask are just, it just depends on the story. Is this corny? Is this believable? That, you know what I mean? That she said this. Does this ring true? And so in my first reader, like my husband and I have been together in some form or fashion for I don't know how many years, a lot of years. So he knows my world almost as well as I do, and the characters that I wrote in my first book. So it's a little bit like asking myself. You know what I mean? In that he's got this kind of depth of knowledge for 15 years of like me writing the same characters. So it's just being able to kind of like just get another like deeply informed opinion. And then I agree. Like once I send it to like my agent, it's just kind of a what do you think, and then kind of an ongoing conversation. Back and forth. The first story in Crooked Hallelujah I worked on for years, not straight through, obviously, but I would put it away because my agent and I went back and forth, and we disagreed on like a certain aspect of the story, and like it's got a lot of different components. It was carrying a lot of weight of introducing like a place, a very specific like church, a family with all their particular like struggles and personality, culture to a certain extent. And so it's doing a lot of things. And also I really wanted to like bring in this trip to a roller coaster. And it felt fundamental to how I saw this character, meeting this character. Like she just wanted to go to a roller coaster, and her fundamentalist like church wouldn't allow it. And and there were so many, there was enough there that there was a novel's worth of story there. And so to function as a short story, like it would have been much easier to eliminate stuff. But I was committed to all those components. And so we went back and forth for maybe 2 years, maybe a little more. But when something didn't work, what I heard was it's not good enough yet. And so I just revised it again. So I was listening, but I wasn't willing to compromise the roller coaster, really. And so I would just keep working. I'd send it back. It's like, the roller coaster's still there. It's like, right, but what do you think about it now? It's not working. If there's too much happening. Okay, like, well, I'll put it in a drawer and I'll work on it again and I'll send it back. And eventually we both loved it eventually, and it was better for that time. But anyway, so I don't know what kinds of questions I ask. Like, does the roller coaster work now is one question I asked over and over and over for years.
I'm so glad you got the roller coaster. I have not read your book, but I'm so glad you got the roller coaster in. And thank you for that PSA for poets, all the poets who are here. It was a wonderful PSA, thank you. So there's some questions that are coming in, and I'm gonna ask this one that's directly to Morgan before we go to ask Catherine's question, because it's specifically to Morgan. So to Morgan, as an Indigenous writer living in a deeply colonial context, land dispossession, high suicide rates, poverty, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and more, what or who inspires you to write?
I think the fact that I am living in a deeply colonial context sort of inspires me to write. I also think a lot about my family. I think a lot about, being Penobscot, what it means, how it will mean, in the future. I think a lot of my work deals with very, traumatic things. Alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, suicide, like all of these things I deal with, I feel like, because they're the only way I can make sense of them, I think, as like a human being. Like I'm saying, writing helps me make sense of this, but as a storyteller, I think, highlighting these things with characters who are complicated and I guess sort of, I don't want to say rotten, but can come across as cruel, but there is some sort of compassion there for, the effects of colonialism and how it's affected them. So I think what and who inspires me, I guess, is, living in Maine, being near I don't live on the Penobscot Reservation anymore, but, being able to see the river all the time, being in my homeland, essentially, that's really inspiring for me. Like, I couldn't see myself operating or writing anywhere else. Like, it's very important for me to be like in this place.
Thank you, Morgan. I love that answer. Catherine asks, thinking of your teachers and editors, are there any ways you remember them getting it right in supporting you, pushing you, asking questions when teaching or editing you from a different lived experience than your own? So teachers from a different, I think Catherine is saying, so if there are teachers and editors from a different lived experience than your own, have they been able to help, have they been able to get it right in terms of supporting you and asking questions?
I can take a shot at this one. I mentioned the editor that was really good. He was the editor actually for 1.5 of my 2 published books. He disappeared partway through the second one, so I had to finish with somebody else. But the things that I liked, his name was Alex. The things I loved about Alex's editing were, number one, he made it clear that he was going to point out things that he thought were problematic or just could be better, but he wasn't going to tell me how to fix them. I've had a really awful experience with one agent who just basically wanted to dictate new scenes to me. Wouldn't it be great if like the 2 characters went to the museum and they had this really awkward exchange and then they realized that they were attracted to each other? It's like, wait a second, that's your book, not my book. But Alex never did anything like that. But he was definitely very clear about what he thought was working and what he thought wasn't working. And there is this thing that happens. I don't know if other writers here feel this as well, but when I send a work off, there's a little part of my brain, a not very logical part, that knows it's already perfect. And so I have to navigate this thing when I get a critique back where I read it once, sort of skimming because it's so squirmy, and then I get really pissed, and then I get really depressed. And then after 48 hours, I'm ready to sort of be logical and rational again and read what they actually said. And he was really good about sending stuff that got me through that process smoothly so that I could see that he was respecting my work, respecting my autonomy as a writer and as the creator of this text, but also really holding me to a new standard. And he was insightful. Not everybody is equally sort of able to see what you're trying to accomplish and say, it's not, I see what you're trying to do here, but it's not quite working. Could you make it clearer? This doesn't quite work for me. So I love that he was willing to really carefully read and take in the work. And then he really did help me. I could not have made those books as good as they were without him. I'm a huge believer in critique, even though it's, as I just sort of narrated, a bumpy ride sometimes. But I'm a huge believer that you cannot create your best work in a vacuum. You need skilled critique to make it better. You need at least another pair of eyes. That can be taken too far, but one good editor is an amazing thing. Yeah, so they respect your work, they engage fully, and then they state what they have to say without pussyfooting around. They call you to task when you need it. That's my ideal editor.
One of my first and really good experiences was in the first time I took an intro to creative writing class and wrote fiction at all. I'd always written poetry or tried to write poetry. And the first time I took an intro class and started to write fiction, a writer in New Orleans named James Nolan was teaching it. And he told me something that really got at the heart of like who and where I come from and helped me see a way to make it work in fiction. And, you know, coming from family of strong Cherokee women and storytellers and Texas and Oklahoma, like we love the sound of our own stories and voices, and like why say something in 2 sentences if you could spend a night talking about it. And he gave me feedback in the very first story I ever wrote, and it's something I carry with me and I talk to students about now. And he basically said with kind of like dialect, because I've always been writing characters who come from where I come from. And so with dialect, he's like, we're gonna get it, and we're gonna get a sense of the place, and we're gonna hear it. You don't have to lean so far into it. And that could be like feedback that could kind of like, that could wreck a person, I could imagine. But for me, I just heard it. I was like, oh, okay. I understand what you're saying. Like the sound of a place comes through, and you can like editing can be good, like, you know. But that was something that got at the heart of the characters I was trying to write. But it's true, it's different reading a 20-page work of fiction than it is sitting in a room with someone who's telling stories all night. Like, it's okay, editing is better in fiction, and sometimes it's good in person too. But
thank you for those responses. I think this is a great question. This is a great question to be our last question. Thank you all for all the folks who dropped questions into the chat box. So this person asks, this person would love to hear how each or any of us think about community and whether that's changed over the past year when it comes to writing. How do you ground your writing in the accompaniment of others who may be unlike you who may be like or unlike you in important ways? What matters to you in seeking or forming communities? Morgan, do you start with that one?
Oh, yeah. I actually feel like my sense of community when it comes to like being part of like a writing community has grown during the pandemic. I don't know why that is. Maybe because it's, I don't know, comfortable sitting in front of a computer and talking to people that way. But I think, I mean, community is very, very important when it comes to writing. I think even, writing is a very private act. I think, as a writer, I'm very, when I say protective of my work, I mean it in a sense that like, it's for me to work with. It's for me to figure out the logic of it, the characters, the consequences of their actions. Like it's like my imagination on the page, and no one else can see it. But eventually, like Lisa said, you can't live in a vacuum, right? You have to have some community, whether that's one person, two person, three person, 10, 20 people that you engage with in some way, whether that's sharing your work, giving advice, helping lift people up, helping them celebrate their accomplishments, spreading the words about their writing, being supportive of them. All of that matters, because if we are just by ourselves writing, it's, what is the point? Writing is about connection. It's about, a reader reading a book, connecting with these characters, having a feeling, and community in a very real sense is the same exact way, outside of the page. Like we all have to be a part of it to be sort of alive, I guess, is what I'm saying. So I think community is very, very important. And I think, I don't know if it's changed so much, maybe I don't know, maybe it has changed. I don't know if other people have thoughts about it, but I think this COVID pandemic has sort of strengthened the writing community, because it was, so many people had books coming out and they had to cancel, like book tours and things like that. And then everything went online. And I think a lot more people showed more support, people were actually there. So I think it stayed pretty consistent. At least that's my take on it. Kelli, you might have a different memory of it, or Lisa, you might have something else too.
I'm unmuted, so I guess I'll go.
Oh, okay.
This one flummoxes me a little bit. I like to work alone when it comes to writing. The pandemic has been pretty pleasant for me. I'm an introvert. I don't care to be in large groups of people for very long in person. And the work is private until it's time to turn towards the market and see if I can sell it. I don't even show it to my wife until I've finished and I'm ready to sort of be open to other people's critique. One of the reasons for that is that I'm horribly susceptible. I'm too susceptible, I think, to other people's ideas and opinions. And so the originality is this kind of delicate thing that I can injure if I let somebody else's views in too soon. So I protect that until it's time, until I know what I've made. There's some sort of sense of completeness. And then I can turn towards the people who are reading. But I'm very careful picking beta readers. I ask a few people usually, and then the publishing process is going to put me in inevitable contact with 3 or 4 other people whose opinions I'm going to have to navigate. I care a great deal about community, depicting community in my writing. I don't want to just present trans characters. I want to present rainbow community. And I put a good deal of thought and care into that. I don't just have one LGBTQ character. Practically everybody in the 2 books that I have published so far is queer in some way, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm proud of that.
Yeah, I think I love that question. I think that there was a lot of urgency towards the beginning of the pandemic. This is what I experienced for poets who were looking to write in community. And I think that, yeah, I agree. Like my writing tends to be very private, but then I think that I know personally I was able to carve out more time to write because I was, my life just shifted dramatically. Like everyone's life shifted dramatically. And I know that there are lots of folks who were looking for writing groups because it just felt easier to do things like this virtually. I think I was pretty fortunate to fall in with a group of poets and writers who I think in the beginning, and maybe still now, we are all queer identified, and so we have that in common. And half of us are Black people or identify as folks of color. And so, so it's been really, really great being able to write with them. So we don't stay consistent with it because I think as many of us, as many folks, we got to the place where we hit the fatigue and we hit the wall. But in the beginning of the pandemic, in the beginning of last year, we were writing writing and sharing pretty frequently. And we were able to do some collaborative projects together in the outside world even. So I like writing in community. I mean, I like doing part of my writing privately, and I like doing part of my writing in community because I think that I can get a little, like I get into the inertia place because it's not often that I'm, you know, I'm like, if I was working on a novel, I think there would be like a little bit more like, there would be a trajectory. Like if I'm writing a poem, I just, if I don't carve out the time every sometime in the week, then I'm just writing haphazardly. And being able to write in community helps me regulate that a little bit, which is really good for my discipline. But I'm in a fatigue place right now. The beginning of this has been rough. I'm not writing anything. Even though I still have that community. We check in on each other, but we're like, are you writing? Are you writing? Ugh, it's rough. Anyway, Kelli, what about you writing? Do you write in the community?
You know, I've been pretty rootless and I've moved around a lot. And so really my writing community has been people who aren't necessarily in the same space as me, physical space. So in terms of, you know, the pandemic, I don't feel like that has changed a lot. One thing about, you know, publishing a book during the pandemic is that people, you know, and this is definitely different from the writing process, but trying to get a book out in the world, you know, like my mom and my aunts, like, whereas like maybe we would have visited somewhere they could have come once, had it not been for everything shifting to Zoom, like they were able to come to so many events that I did. So in a strange way, the pandemic, like having a book come out during it, like opened it up to people from home. And, you know, and just see like my mom's and auntie's faces in the little squares, like when I'm like doing an event in Maine, maybe, you know, like, which is really, that's a beautiful thing, that certainly would not have happened otherwise. So that's kind of a different take on how this has all gone. In terms of like the writing process, it's, I mean, I've just struggled to write during the pandemic, but in terms of who I share with, it's the same. It's printing it out and handing it to my husband or sending it over email. So that didn't really change a lot. I'm a homebody. I'm like feel really, really lucky to have been able to mostly continue working from home. I've had to cut back on how much work because, you know, there's also an 8-year-old here 24/7. So, but yeah, I feel pretty lucky for how I've been able to manage all of this so far.
I like the way you like the pauses on the 24/7. I think everybody, yeah, people are dropping in the chat. Everyone who has, you know, young folks who were there with them 24/7 probably felt that ricochet all through their body. So thank you, Kelli, Joe. Thank you, Lisa. I am wondering if Taryn's going to come back to wrap things up. Thank you, all of you folks who are.
Or I can just really quickly, I don't even think you can see me because I'm not pinned, which I can try to do, but just thank you guys. This has been really wonderful. I've loved hearing everything that you all had to say. If this was in person and not on Zoom, I could probably listen for longer, but just thank you so much. This has been really great and we're really appreciative. And thanks for everyone who's gathered too. Round of applause. You can turn on off your mutes and cheer for these guys. They've been great. Thank you. Woohoo! Thank you, interpreters, too. You guys were all wonderful as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelli. Thank you,
Thanks.
Lisa.
Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan.